So welcome everybody. I am excited to be here with you. Today we're going to talk about advancing forward amid a crisis. And we're really here to talk about tax purposes, from an elder law perspective. But I thought it was really important to talk about this crisis from people who, as businesses, interact with older people, or have employees that we have to interact with older people. And so my presentation for the next 50 minutes, actually about 45 now, is going to focus on advancing forward amid this crisis. And it's going to bring in tax elements, but it's also going to bring in elements of kind of where are we right now as businesses and moving forward. So as Kyle said, my name is Julie Steinbacher, and many of you I know quite well. And it's good to see you, even if it's only virtually. It would have been fun to get together in our resource center and have some time to see each other, but this will do for right now. We do have locations in Williamsport and State College, and our firm focuses on estate and long-term care planning, which many of you know. We also do quite a bit of business succession planning, and we do that in a way that is very step-by-step. What I find is that most people who come to me for business succession planning, they may not even have their businesses set up right correctly. And so we have to spend some time on that. Wealth protection planning. And for many of our clients, to be honest with you, the wealth protection planning side of it is a lot of income tax planning, a lot of thinking about what happens if somebody dies and what's going to happen income tax wise. And then, of course, estate administration. I have done quite a few things over the years, but one of the things I wanted to share with everybody is I really have a passion right now in my life around Alzheimer's and dementia. So I did a TEDx talk about this and about how we as communities need to keep those with dementia and Alzheimer's more connected with us because we don't do that in this nation. We also at our firm focus on helping people with Alzheimer's and dementia across that journey. I'm also a part owner of Nipponos Valley Village, which I have to say, during the pandemic is one of the harder things that I end up doing. To be honest with you, last night I had to be the short order cook because we're low on staffing. So for all of the books we have, whether it's Alzheimer's or dementia, whether it's about second half of life, there are always things that we would make available to you or to your clients if they were ever interested in it. So today, in this section, we're going to talk about vaccinations, where that is, but also the question of what if our staff doesn't want to get vaccinations? How do we feel about it? And what to do if we think that's important? And again, remember that I come from an elder law perspective. So at my office, we're pretty stringent on the rules. We follow them to the T because we interact with people every day who are health compromised, who have comorbidities, who are 80, 90 years old, who are getting treated for cancer. So we deal with the most vulnerable population. But I could say that many of you here also will be dealing with that if we think about tax season coming up and thinking about, dropping stuff off or getting stuff to clients. Think about how much of your some of it is just this is what the law requires, and then some of it is to what degree are you going to really police this and get behind it, and some of that may for you depend on the clients that you serve. We're talking about employee care and procedures. So we have obligations as employers. So for those of you on here as employers or in management positions at firms, there's obligations that we have to employees that we need to make sure. Talk about some grants. How could we not talk about the PPP forgiveness and taxation? And then finally, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which actually came back out, probably in March or April. It is set to expire at the end of the month, but we'll see what actually happens with that. So vaccinations, I suppose anybody who got up this morning and turned the news on probably knows more about this than what this slide says. But the reality of it is, we have vaccines that are coming. We certainly understand that those vaccines will be given to, workers, long-term care facilities, and those who are older. Although there's a real debate right now, there's definitely going to go to healthcare workers and people in long-term care facilities. Although we don't know the definition of that. We don't know, does that include nursing homes like Valley View, or does it also include personal care homes like Elmcroft? So we don't actually know where that line is going to be drawn, which I think is unfortunate. There is a huge debate right now about whether or not the next group of people would be those who are older, or frontline workers, like essential employees, like people who work in factories to get us our food. And that's an interesting debate. It's a debate about whether or not we are going to stimulate our economy or protect those who are most vulnerable. And there's no right or wrong answer to that, but it certainly is there. Certainly, we understand that 40% of the deaths in the US have occurred in long-term care facilities. And I will say to you that we at our law firm are no strangers to that. I tip my hats off to people who work in long-term care facilities. I know at our office, there's been twice that we've been quite shaken by just the amount of deaths that we've had of clients in a week. And so we certainly represented many people who were at the Milton Nursing Home in June when people passed away. And now that's being faced by Centercrest, both of which are good facilities. And we represented quite a few people there. In fact, had 8 of our clients die last week. And that's hard. And I say that it's hard on us. I can't imagine the people that work in those facilities and how difficult that is. And so we really want to think about the reality of that. And, again, thinking about what it is that we're going to do in response to all of that. So the question is, can you mandate a COVID-19 vaccine for your employers? It's an interesting question, and I have a source there that's really interesting to read about whether or not you can mandate this for your employees, moving forward. There was a poll that was done that basically said that 65% of Americans will take the vaccine. 35% said no. Now, I have to say, this poll is, from back in, this Gallup poll is from back July 20th to August 2nd. And I think some people's minds may have changed since then. That was a time when we didn't really know about the vaccine. Certainly, there's a lot more that has come to light about their effectiveness, but also, how they're based. They're based on proteins, which, many people, the articles that I read would say that it may not work, but it won't harm you. And so, I don't know if the 35% there were saying no because they were concerned. I have to say I was concerned in that time period, or if the 35% are people who believe it's their fundamental right not to do this. Not good or bad. Everybody is allowed to have their own opinion, but it's interesting to know what would happen with that. So what are some considerations with this? Well, people can start saying that they don't want to take the vaccine for many different reasons. And there's law that may support some of that. So certainly we always go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that allows religious accommodations without undue hardship. And so the thing with this, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there certainly could be people who say for religious purposes, because there's other types of vaccines that for religious purposes people choose not to take. And so the thing is, it has to really be a religious belief. It can't just be my ethical or oral conviction. It has to be very deep-seated within a religion itself. But like I said, there is some of that across the nation where people have beliefs about whether or not to use vaccinations at all, not just about COVID-19, but just in general. The American with Disabilities Act does the individual have a disability that's somehow covered with this situation? What I can say is I think, from my perspective, the Americans with Disability Act would actually work the opposite way because COVID-19 meets the direct threat standard. And what that means is that the ADA prohibits employers from excluding individuals with disabilities from the workplace for health and safety reasons unless they pose a direct threat. So COVID-19 is a direct threat. So we are allowed to say, no, you can't come to work if you have symptoms or if you have COVID-19, and go pretty far with, masks. So I know that I confronted that early on with the personal care home that I own. One person said they just couldn't wear a mask, and because of a medical condition that they had. And the reality of it is I didn't have to give an accommodation. So that person was in direct contact with individuals because COVID-19 is a direct threat. If they didn't want to wear a mask, that was fine. They didn't have to, but I didn't have to accommodate. That means that I didn't have to change their job to meet their needs. I didn't have to change their job in a way that they didn't have to be around people or that they were only 6 feet apart. So in that situation, that's helpful. Although for most of us in our businesses, we're not going to necessarily have that direct threat. There are many ways to not have to have so much contact with individuals. For many of you, you get to do a lot of docu-signing in a lot of ways that you just don't have to meet with people face to face anymore. Unfortunately for the law, we're not as lucky in that situation. We cannot electronically sign estate planning documents. So in Pennsylvania, wills, powers of attorneys, they must be signed not in person, not electronically. There is a notary law in Pennsylvania that allows remote notarization. We as an office, as soon as that came out, we jumped on it. We had somebody become an electronic notary. Our staff got together and actually did the documents for one of our younger attorneys that works for us. And what we found was honestly that it just was not a realistic answer to the question. It just was not something that we could do every day for all clients. And that has to do with, the company that you have to do and paying that company money to verify the identity and just other steps that were involved. So it does exist. Our office can do it. We actually have a situation right now that we are debating whether or not we should do that in the utmost of caution for our clients moving forward. So definitely something that we want to think about as we move forward with that. So what does this really mean for us, moving forward? Well, it's something you're going to have to keep an eye on. And two things that I would keep my eye on is the CDC guidance on implementing the flu vaccines. There already is guidance on the CDC about how that shakes out. But the other thing that you may not have thought about as an employer recently, because we're in the service industry, is OSHA. So OSHA is something that we think about often in industries where people can get hurt, and OSHA certainly requires that we as employers or clients that you serve as employers have a workplace free from harm. We have every employer has an obligation to protect their employees and make it free from harm. There is some really interesting guidance from OSHA that really puts a burden on the employer to make sure that the workplace is free from harm, including COVID-19 and including. So for those of you who may represent businesses or may yourself be thinking, I don't really care if people wear a mask. I don't really care, from that perspective, we're not going to necessarily be implementing that. Just know that OSHA could come back and say you have an obligation. So there's certainly all kinds of guidance out there. There's the CDC, there's the federal government, there's certainly the Pennsylvania Department of Health. that has all kinds of obligations just recently about signage that you have to have within your workplaces, and OSHA. So if you haven't thought about this, particularly if you're in an industry, maybe as a tax preparer, that you haven't had people in your office and you're about to do that, I would suggest that you sit down some night and read some of this, read the Pennsylvania guidance and look at the signs that are required. They just changed, like I said, right before Thanksgiving. And so we had to put extra signage in our office. I certainly read the OSHA requirements and regulations. I also do look at the CDC guidance. I can't say that any of this is crystal clear, but I think, making an intentional choice, understanding what your obligations are as an employer in Pennsylvania is really important as you move forward. So what do we do to prepare now? We have to think about any interaction with clients or being at the office. Is it necessary? Is it necessary, for the vaccine? How many accommodations will you have to field? Certainly remember that, there are accommodations. There are people who may be on our workforces who have anxiety, for instance, and it's upsetting to come in if they're concerned about COVID-19, and that might be something we do have to make an accommodation for. Would you cover the cost of the vaccine? I don't think that's as much of an issue. It seems to me that what I have read is that those are going to be offered at a very low cost. But the cost that I know our office actually just incurred was we actually tested every one of our employees. We made the decision to do that after Thanksgiving to make sure that none of us were asymptomatic carriers. So we, just like every place else, we've had people who have COVID. We had people who were concerned about COVID, got tested, maybe didn't have it. I feel like at our office, sometimes it's every day, who are we going to have to cover and what are we going to have to do differently from that perspective? We did decide that we were going to test everybody coming in, just as a baseline. That's been done in other companies, and they've uncovered people who were asymptomatic. And we certainly want to make sure, again, that even with everything that we're doing, that we do as much as possible. You also may want to review your workers' comp policy and other insurances that you may have that would look to this issue. So, I've kind of said to you that you have an obligation. So what are the things that you can do? So consider options to increase physical space and distancing. I still know a lot of businesses that have 2 people within one office. I think that to the extent you can create more space and physical distancing, that's helpful. According to the CDC, they say to clean and disinfect surfaces touched by multiple people frequently. At our office, we actually, in both my Williamsburg office and my State College office, we have a pandemic safety officer. So we chose somebody that it's their job to think about this and be concerned about this. And we actually disinfect the conference room every time somebody comes in. So we make sure there's a half an hour between every appointment. In the summer, we were opening the window. We don't do that as much in the winter. It's a little cold some days to do that. So, again, this comes directly from the CDC website, and just kind of thinking about how does that go within our business. The other thing that was suggested on the CDC website is allowing your staff to have a break to wash their hands. And I would say particularly if you had like a tax office and there's a lot of people dropping off stuff, I think just, saying, hey, it's okay, to go wash your hands, certainly use hand sanitizer, but, washing your hands is always a bit better, according to the CDC. So you may want to have a relief person so that person has some time to get away through that. So what if an employee comes to work with COVID-19 symptoms? At our office, we've just said to people, don't come. We actually use an app called Protect Well, where each of our staff has to self-check in every day. to say, yes, I am clear of symptoms. Prior to that, what we had is an employee who did a temperature check and ask about the symptoms. And we've stopped doing that because it's so hard with people coming in at different times. And so we use the Protect Well app. All of the staff has it. They have to sign in that they don't have any symptoms, and then they'll be cleared to go to work. Here's the thing with it that's really hard, and I continue to hear it happening where people are like, oh, well, I have a cold, but I don't have COVID-19. What we've said at my office is, I'm not a doctor. I don't know if you have COVID-19. Neither does Sarah. So any symptoms that you have that appear on the list, whether it's fever, chills, cough, lack of smell, whatever it is, we're not just going to say, oh, there are seasonal allergies or it's a little cold. I've certainly had people within my own family who ended up having COVID, in my extended family, not my immediate family, but my extended family. And they certainly thought that they didn't. They were surprised when the test came back. And so if they're at work and they develop symptoms, they should go home immediately. If they develop symptoms outside of work, they should notify the supervisor and stay home. And this is hard because again, particularly for those of you in tax offices, when it's so important and you guys work so many hours, and to not have somebody there. But I think, it would be better if somebody stayed home than to come into the office and then you have a real problem if they end up having COVID-19. We actually had a employee at our office who had COVID-19. She in one day was in both my state college and my Williamsburg office, and so over the weekend, I'm having to think through about, did she have close physical contact with anybody? Luckily in her situation, she doesn't work with any clients. And she didn't end up having close physical contact with anybody. We certainly contacted people that she may have been around, but we did not feel like any of it was close physical contact. So important. Now, I know some of you are, kind of lucky, maybe as financial advisors, your industry, luckily for you, seems to have pivoted easier than the law industry, signing things, through DocuSign and over the internet, and the ability to be able to work from home, socially distance. And what I would say is, take advantage of that as much as possible. Although, the flip side of it is certainly productivity. And the flip side of it is also some people just really wanting to come to the office. So currently, the state of Pennsylvania says you should be teleworking unless it's impossible. As an attorney, the word impossible, I don't even know what that means, to be honest with you. I certainly have thought about it, but we certainly have people within our offices who can separate themselves. And so we have people within the offices every day, and much more than what we did when we were closed down. So what if an employee is expected or confirmed to have COVID-19? You don't really need to shut down your facility, but to close off any areas that person has used any prolonged times. I know one of the things that we always worry about at our office is, do people share the same bathroom or the same break room? So just to cut down on having to quarantine more people, we've urged people to use the same bathroom and urged people not to use bathrooms that aren't on their floor. We also have urged people not to use our break room, too much. We certainly don't sit there and eat together. I know I myself have brought more lunches in that I don't need to warm up in the microwave. So, depending on how, and for me, it's not a fear of, oh my goodness, getting COVID. It's a reality that if somebody has COVID in the building, then I have an obligation as an employer to have a whole bunch of people quarantining, and how can I keep my business together? So we want to limit exposure just to limit the quarantine. To be honest with you, some of the problems that the school districts are having, I know with Jersey Shore School District, they're remote, not that they have a huge COVID breakout, but they have too many teachers who have to quarantine, and they can't come into the school. And that's actually the issue there that's causing the remote working. So it's not so much, hey, is all these people going to get sick, but what's expected of us. And so the thought is to wait 24 hours before cleaning and disinfecting to minimize potential for other employees being exposed to the respiratory droplets, because within 24 hours they'll have fallen, and then you can just clean everything. If you want to not go to the expense of sanitizing, the CDC website says wait 7 days. And so in 7 days, you could go back. If you could block that part off for 7 days, you wouldn't have to go to the expense of sanitizing. Although, I've sanitized at the personal care home I own, and it's actually kind of fun. I have this little sanitizing gun, and so that's really what we want to talk about. So far we've talked about vaccinations, we talked about employee care. But the other thing we want to think about from our perspective, whether you're a financial advisor or an accountant or an attorney, is all of the different programs out there, and thinking about, are there programs people should be looking at going after? What's the taxation of those programs? I'll talk about the payroll, the PPP, and I think that might be a nightmare for some accountants, and how people have entered that into their system, and whether or not they've done the application for forgiveness. So we're just going to talk about these. The Federal and State Technology Partnership, this is a program through the SBA that provides funding. The Portable Assistance Program, these programs, some of these programs are more for small business associations providing more information. But then, so whether or not you actually get through this program, or you check with your local small business association office to see if they have gotten funding for any programs for any businesses within your area. Certainly county by county, it's very different. There certainly was in Lycoming County, Center County, money handed out to small businesses, and thinking about, again, how do they put that on their books, through all of that. There is also an SBA debt relief, and that's a really interesting program. It allows somebody who has an SBA loan to get debt relief. And there's qualifications for that as you go through it. What I want to spend most of my time on, the Payroll Protection Forgiveness Loan Program application and the effect of that. But I didn't want to not talk about these different grants. Again, if I was gearing up for tax season, it's definitely something I would want to look at, these different grants, and look at the different taxations between state and federal government, for your clients. So the PPP forgiveness, it does have to be submitted within 10 months of completion. And I know that that's kind of hard for some businesses. My period was forgiven in June, but I didn't even get the right forms or the proper forms, or the rules changed, to be honest with you, in August and September. We have submitted our forgiveness application. But then there's also is it going to be approved? So I think most people who are working with, my experience across the nation is those people working with small local banks are finding that this is really an okay process. I know myself personally, I work with Woodlands Bank. John Engel's been amazing, keeping me up to date with information, talking to me. But he doesn't know all the answers either, just because through the SBA, we don't know. But one of the things I would do is really encourage your clients to apply for loan forgiveness. I feel like this is one of those things that people may not do because it's slightly overwhelming. And so they just put it on the to-do list. It is, I have to say, it took a lot for us to figure it out, particularly when they changed the rules. So in my situation, I had figured it out really precisely in what I was going to do, but my husband and I have a partnership that we own real estate that rent was paid through from my law firm. And that's rent that's been paid for many, many years. And I counted on that information. But when they made the change that you can't use any rent that has been given to an entity that you are a part owner in, I had to kind of duck and roll and figure out a different way to do that. And for me, I actually used the money exactly as the way they intended. I paid people who were home and not working. Once the forgiveness ran out, that money ran out, I did have to reduce my staff. And so when I tried to fill it out, there was an issue there that I didn't have enough staff, even though I would have. So it's hard. The reality of it is we were probably one of the first people to get it. We went through our covered period, and then they changed the rules three months later. And that I'm not complaining about. I'm just saying that as businesses and those of us that interact with businesses, encouraging them to get this done, I think is really important. Also, we come in this situation where we're like in 2020, and we may not be forgiven until 2021. And so, what happens? We'll talk about that and deducting expenses. But we really want to make sure that this is put in. We also want to think about, so for an accountant, I think the biggest issue right now is communicating with clients about how are they entering this on the books, both the acceptance of the money and then their forgiveness. And important to them to think about, particularly right now, having the conversation with them, particularly if you have larger businesses, about their estimated payments. Because if they haven't entered the PPP money as income, which they probably haven't, but they've used all the expenses. So on their P&L, they have all of their expenses in there, and those expenses may not be deductible if it's forgiven. So we want to think about, are we looking at good information for our estimates? Do we really know where we stand from an income tax point? And so I think, most of you probably, if you're an accountant, you send out letters at the end of the year. I think that's something you should highlight with people to make sure that if you're having quick conversations about estimates, that it's based on good information. So where we are, at least from what I could find, this came out quite a while ago. And as of November, it's still the same. There's no deduction allowed for an expense that's otherwise deductible if the payment of the expense results in forgiveness of a covered loan. And so the PPP money is not income. The forgiveness of debt is not income. But whatever I use to pay for that is not a deduction either. Now that's neutral. It's tax neutral. However, and there's certainly some thoughts that the IRS, there's a movement towards, well, they should still be deductible to help the businesses. I don't know what's going to go on with that. And I don't know if anybody has any insight, feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to, let us know. But that's where we're at this point in time with the PPP. Which I think is probably what you're going to spend a lot of your time talking about. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the First Family Coronavirus Response Act. This came out back in April, and in May it was more regulations were put out about it. I have to tell you, I see very few people following this, and it is required to be followed. It is not voluntary. Now, there's a question about whether or not a company has to follow it, but basically, eligible employees need to receive up to 2 weeks of paid sick leave due to a qualifying reason related to COVID, due to quarantine, inability to work because of illness or symptoms, and are awaiting a medical diagnosis. Eligible employees can receive up to 2 weeks, 80 hours of paid sick leave at a 2/3 rate due to take care of individuals subject to quarantine, such as the closure of a school or a daycare, and up to 10 weeks of pay, expanding the Family Medical Leave Act at 2/3 of a rate of pay. So I talked to probably 5 or 6 people in the last week that they were off work because of COVID and they're not getting paid for it. And if it's a covered employer, they're supposed to be getting paid for it. Now, this runs out December 31st, but it's something I would watch because it's certainly something that's been talked about being extended with the stimulus rounds and all those conversations. So, interestingly, employers, even if you're a private employer with fewer than 500 employees, you still have to do this. In fact, it's not written like other laws. Other laws are saying if you have less than 50 people, this does not apply to you. That's not the way this is written. This is written to say you may qualify for exemption if you have less than 50 employees, although you have to say on a state-by-state basis, case-by-case basis. So I would say you don't need to comply with the expanded Family Medical Leave Act. But I would say, even if you're an employer with less than 50 employees, this is something you should be looking through and making an intentional decision about. If you're telling people that they're quarantining and they can't work and you're not paying them, you better have what is your case-by-case basis to substantiate why you qualify for an exemption through that. So what are qualifying reasons for leave? If they're subject to federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation orders, clearly if people can telework, then they have to work. But advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine related to COVID-19, experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, and seeking a medical diagnosis. So again, if somebody's experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, but they feel okay and they can telework, then they need to telework. But if, like, for instance, it was your receptionist at your office and most of what they did was in-office work and they had to stay home for 2 weeks, this would say that you need to pay them. Also caring for an individual subject to an order or self-quarantine, caring for a child whose school or place of care is closed, experiencing any other substantially similar condition. Now, for caring for others, remember, they only get 2/3 of their salary, but if it's them themselves that's sick, they get the full salary. So what happens with this? Well, let's say, again, I, as the employer, have to have to pay somebody who's quarantined. There is tax credits. The Family First Coronavirus Response Act. You can claim those credits with your tax return on your Form 941, or you can reduce your federal employment tax deposits, which is the faster option if you had to do that. The last guidance about this was updated on November 25th, and where I looked was on the IRS website for that. So I've had to deal with this, certainly as a personal care home. When people are quarantining, they can't work. Because there's no real telework there as direct caregivers, and you are required to do this. I'm not sure why people pretend that this law doesn't exist, but it does. And if an employee, got upset about it, found out that they had these rights and you didn't honor them, there could be issues. So finally, just thinking about staying energized and up to date on all your people initiatives. The CDC, there's definitely quarantine changes. It's being changed to 7 to 10 days instead of the full 14. Announced on 12/2 that there's 2 other options. If you're asymptomatic, after 10 days, you can end the quarantine. And after 7 days, if you have no symptoms or a negative test, if tested by at least day 5, still want to monitor and wear the mask. This is really coming from 14 days is so long, and they're feeling like if they're shorter, maybe more people would comply. But you as a business can still keep with the 14 days. It's interesting that this guidance has come out, but they haven't changed the law of what I as an employer need to pay. If you choose to change your protocol, you need to update your policies at your work. If it were me, I'd probably wait a week or two to do that, and to retrain the employees, and just knowing that the cases are so high right now. So when you need to send an employee home, the 6-15-48 rule, if they were within 6 feet, 15 minutes for a 24-hour period, starting from 2 days before the illness onset. So the 2 days, somebody is not contagious if it's more than 2 days before the illness onset. So if the onset of the illness was on Wednesday, Monday would be the day, Tuesday and Monday would be the days that they could have been getting somebody else infected. At our office, we are encouraging telework as much as possible, but we also understand a balance of having to get out of the house, having more things at the office. What we just try to do is to alternate who is there, so that we're completely, we have to be very interdependent with each other so that we can stay spread out. So if we are still working remotely, what do we need to do with our teams? One of the things that I think is really important is that, if you're on here, you might be in a situation where this doesn't affect your income. It doesn't affect a huge amount of your life, except for having to figure out new answers. But remember that you could have people working for you who are living paycheck to paycheck, and this is really important. You have an obligation to reassure people, to make sure that you have as much communication as possible, regular meetings, face-to-face by video, if that's a thing, and make sure that things are defined and clarified for people. Here's some conversation starters, just making sure that everybody's okay. Just making sure, and this is something that it may be not you. You may be like, oh, Julie, I already know this, but you might have somebody working for you, under you, who's now managing other people, and they're not really sure how to do all of this. And so I think, it's not whether or not telework works, it's whether or not we've communicated well enough with our staff to make sure that they feel comfortable and they know what's expected of them. I always think good communication is important, and it's definitely the bridge between confusion and clarity. In my office, if there's a staff person that's not doing what I want, I very much work to think, I must not have communicated well enough. What is it that I could do better? And I definitely feel that during COVID, that's been more difficult. To make sure. Now, I'm a verbal person. I'd rather talk to people in person. I'd rather not write them an email, but I've had to make myself write longer emails with more details, and sometimes call people and move forward. But from that perspective, what I wanted to share with you in this little bit of time that we had together was a look at that COVID, and just to get you to think about, how do you move forward with your business, or what's in front of you during all of this. And certainly it's something that I've had to talk about a lot and deal with a lot. And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to us. The one thing about my office is that we are as policy driven as possible. So if you want to see our checklist for what happens after an appointment, or if you want to see, what our procedures are for our staff, I'd be happy to share them.